Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad I could see everybody today. I just noticed there was some interesting feature that popped up in Zoom. Did anybody else see that?
I just saw that too. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so we are continuing our exploration through the Daodejing. And let me share my screen here. Today we are in chapter 31. And this is kind of ties into the one we had 2 weeks ago. We had a break last week for Thanksgiving for those that were in the US. Hope you all had a nice break. Martin, I know you popped in.
Unknowingly.
Yeah, I again, if you go to that address that I list at the end each time to the kinship.cafe website, you can register your email, and you'll also get emails when things like that happen, so that you don't get confused. But you might have to use something other than your New Rocket email address, because for some reason those get I don't know if it's the spam process or something like that. They don't seem to work all the time. But anyway, I'll edit that part out. Uh, we'll go ahead and get started. This is carrying on the theme, again, from a couple weeks ago, that is dealing with the issue of war, which is rather pertinent given world situation. And they definitely have something to say about that. And let's go ahead and look at what that is. So it starts off, good weapons are instruments of fear. All creatures hate them. Therefore, followers of Tao never use them. The wise prefer the left. Soldiers prefer the right. I'll pause here and we'll kind of explore this for just a moment. This is one of those ones where there were a lot of disagreements on what this meant. To me, this seemed rather obvious, but I don't know exactly why. So I'm going to share my thoughts on this, and you can let me know what you think. But the context here is dealing with weapons, and ultimately the question of war, as we'll see where the rest of this chapter goes. And it's, again, with the Daodejing, we have something that is being used to address not just individuals, but maybe even more and specifically potential rulers or people who aspired to rule in terms of how they should go about the process. So when we think about from a martial perspective, imagine you're in the old days and you had a sword or maybe a knife, and you had somebody that you were wanting to protect, and there was an opponent in front of you. The action that you're going to take, or at least that comes naturally to a lot of people, is with your left arm, you're going to hold them behind you, and with your right arm, you're going to wield whatever that weapon is that you're going to put between you and the opponent or the assailant. And I believe that this is what they're getting at with the left and the right, is the position that is taken between these three people. So there's the person who is, in this case, let's say a soldier. It's got somebody they are wanting to protect on the left, and the opponent is in front of them to the right. So there's two different sides of that person who's got the sword. The left side for protection of somebody, the right side for how they are attacking or doing something with their weapon. Now, there's times when this might get reversed that we're going to look at later on, but I think this is the primary ordering orientation that they're trying to get at with this idea of the left and the right and how that applies in this context. Is that track okay? You following? Does that seem like kind of a natural response of how you might do something, protecting somebody behind your left arm and wielding a weapon with your right, if you're right-handed, I should say?
I'm a lefty, so no.
So it'd be reverse maybe for you, right? So
Yeah.
non-dominant hand would be the one, like if you're like protecting a little kid or somebody, you'd put them behind you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see how this plays out further on and
It
see if
has a certain logic to it, although it's not how I personally would do things. I
in
can
terms
understand
of
the logic of it.
actual like warfare kind of strategy.
Well, like in terms of martial arts techniques, if you're attacking with a knife, I would actually put my empty hand in front and have the knife behind me so that they couldn't like deflect it or grab or block it. I grab onto them and then with the other hand and stab them. I wouldn't like hold the knife out in front of me. But logically, like I wouldn't do that because I've trained that way. But logically, I could understand how a person might instinctively do that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's thinking in terms of um, if you go into battle and you have a king or somebody like that, they're going to be standing not on your weapon side, right? Because they're the one that you're supposed to protect. And so your weapon side is going to be the one that's going to be open to the opponent. The left side is going to be where you have the person you're trying to protect. All right. So let's see where this all goes then. Comes back to weapons. Weapons are instruments of fear. They are not tools of the wise. They use them only when there is no choice. So this is an important point here within the Daodejing, is that it's not a utterly and complete pacifist type manifesto, because there is a point where they are suggesting that there could be a need for weapons or a need for violence or for defense or something along those lines. But it's clearly something that is not favored and something, as it says here, only when there's no other choice. Peace and quiet are dear to their hearts. This is
Didn't
again,
it say earlier that the wise don't use weapons at all?
that is an interesting point,
A
right?
couple
So there's a
lines
little
ago.
bit of kind of a hyperbole that gets used when you're looking at some of the statements here. And you have to take them in the sense that they are showing, I don't want to say the extremes aren't quite the right way to look at it, but if you're talking in more kind of parabolic, like as in parable type language, there's going to be things that sound more extreme that you don't want to necessarily take to that extreme. In the same way that we might say something like, when it rains, it pours, doesn't mean every time it rains, it's actually pouring. It just is an example of something that, sometimes you get more than what you're expecting. Or if you say a watch pot never boils, it doesn't mean that if you watch the pot, it will literally never boil. It just means it's saying something about, how impatience makes things seem like they take longer. So I think that would be kind of in the vein we want to look at some of these statements where it's like would never do something, but only if they have to, kind of balancing those two options out would kind of fit within that style of talking. So then again, in referring to the wise person here, and I should also clarify, when they're translated this idea of wise person here, it is not the same as sage that is normally being translated as wise. So the type of character they're talking about here could maybe be translated as gentleman or maybe even nobleman or something along those lines. So it is not like a Taoist sage, but more of somebody who is uh, maybe just more generally wise. So in this case, they're saying for that person, peace and quiet are dear to their hearts, and victory, no cause for rejoicing. So we're getting a little bit of this deglorification of this idea of violence or potentially war that's starting to unfold here. Says, if you rejoice in victory, then you delight in killing. If you delight in killing, you cannot fulfill yourself. Now, yourself here is an interesting translation. I would like to find out a little bit more why they said that, but it's bringing in a term that we've seen frequently, which is Tianxia, which is all underneath heaven. And if we think about this being presented to either a ruler or an aspiring ruler, the idea is, how do you organize or bring people together under your leadership? And so the idea here is that if you are somebody who delights in killing, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to get the people to rally around you. So they have, I'm going to bring in a slightly different translation here. This is from David Hinton. It says, if you savor killing people, you'll never guide all beneath heaven. So again, how do you bring that together for people? How do you organize them? Part of what's going on in terms of how we say this, because we might be thinking there's a whole lot of people that get behind violence and winning in war and supporting war in our culture. It can be something that is a big rallying cry that can gain a lot of support and a lot of momentum. This would definitely be something that's a big cultural difference, at least at the time that this was being composed during that classical Chinese period. And as we'll see at the end, this is an area where there is a lot of agreement between a lot of the different schools of thought, including the Confucius thought group. And we'll look at some texts where they have very similar statements. And from what I understand historically, there wasn't a lot of like celebration of like war heroes or something like that within this classical Chinese period. It wasn't until much later that those kinds of things came into vogue. So we definitely have a little bit of a difference in how culture is approaching things here. So then we come back to the left and right situation. It says, on happy occasions, presence. Is that the right word? I don't know if I wrote that correctly now. I think it was supposed to be preferences given to the left. And on sad occasions, to the right.
Is it precedence?
Maybe it's
precedence.
Yeah. I have to go back and look and make sure I wrote that correctly. Sometimes spell check fixes things in weird ways. But in any case, the idea that we saw that victory was no cause for celebration would see this thing that we're seeing on the bottom here, on sad occasions to the right. So sad occasions would be when that violence is necessary or when that violence is used. Happy occasions is kind of the other way around. So if we think about the person that's being protected or honored or whatever the case may be that's on the left, now they might actually, in a sense, be visible on the right, even though what they're saying here is that it's the precedence or the favor is being given at this point to the left. So in certain situations, that person who's normally being protected, who's behind on the left, might move to the fore if it's honoring them for something, or if that person is, let's say, like the king or the emperor is doing some kind of presentation, maybe awarding somebody something, then the situation changes. The whole ordering of where the soldier is and where the protected person is goes through a transformation, given on the context of what's happening. So then it says, thus the left is for, this is another translation, excuse me, that it kind of brings out a little bit more of this. Thus the left is for deeds that are blessed, and the right for deeds that bring death. And again, I would put this in the context of what they're talking about in terms of war or combat. In the army, the general stands on the left and the commander-in-chief on the right, which you would think is just the opposite of what we just talked about, where the commander-in-chief would be one that would be the protected one, and the general would be the one that would be defending or potentially attacking. But what they're saying, and I don't know if this would be what actually happened in certain contexts there, or if this is something that they are presenting as what should be, but what the implication of this would be is what they say, this means that war is conducted like a funeral. So if we think about a funeral situation, you might have that favored person, the king or the emperor, actually coming out and saying something at the funeral of those that had fallen in war or something along those lines. And so that we would see those positions reversed between the left and right. Now that person, that commander in chief, the president, the king, the emperor, would be out in front because they would be conducting some type of ceremony. And so what they're saying here is if you approach war that way, that means that war is conducted like a funeral. So again, this deglorification of that whole process. When many people are killed, they should be mourned in heartfelt sorrow. That is why a victory must be observed like a funeral. Very powerful position they've taken in terms of, very clear about this anti-war stance, at least in terms of not that there's never a situation where it's required, but something that definitely shouldn't be sought after and definitely not something that should be gloried in. I want to tie this into one other piece that we've kind of talked about in terms of this image of uncarved wood. And we've looked at in the past how the imagery of uncarved wood versus the carved wood has a lot to do with these kind of social desires to get people to conform to something, literally to be carved into shape to fit into something that's maybe not a natural way that they would be. And so the Taoist reaction to things like strict hierarchies and formal rules of how you recognize, different statuses, they would say causes resistance because people don't naturally fit into those positions. And when you have to carve them up into those, that's what ultimately is behind the strife that's happening. And again, the context here being of the dawn of that warring states period. So if we think about this concept of trying to achieve goals with war, this would be maybe the most extreme example of this idea of carving wood, of trying to force something to be a certain way that maybe it isn't naturally. Then I mentioned that in this case, there's actually great agreement between the Confucius and the Taoist. And I just want to bring in a couple of quotes from Mencius, who is kind of a second generation writer in the Confucius realm, and potentially just before this current version of the Daodejing was maybe composed. There's a lot of questions on the exact timing of things, but they're pretty close to being contemporary. So we'll just see a little bit more of this kind of general position. So he says, who can unify all beneath heaven? One who has no lust for killing. Today, all of the world's great shepherds share a lust for killing. If there were someone free from that lust, people everywhere under heaven would crane their necks watching for him to come. And if such a man really appeared, the people going home to him would be like a flood of water pouring down. It would be like this utter amazement that there was finally a ruler who wasn't approaching things with this idea of violence.
Sounds
Couple
like a
more
cult.
little quotes. Those who excel at war should receive the highest punishment. Now, what was happening just prior to this statement is he was talking about how the bodies pile up in the cities and the towns when there's a war that's going on. And he even uses a line that's something along the lines of, this is teaching the earth to be hungry, or something along those lines, in terms of how the bodies all pile up. And that's where he comes in with this line about those who excel at war should receive the highest punishment. And then again, he says, there are people who say, I am an expert in war and tactics, but they're just common criminals. Now, lots of different perspectives on war and how it exists in our world today, as well as violence. This is looking at what was being perceived, obviously, at this period in China at that time. And so maybe we can just have some conversation on what you guys think about this.
War, what is it good for?
Yes. Let's see, who was that? Oh gosh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. Erwin or Edwin something. Anybody remember? It's a great song.
No, Jackie Chan and Chris Rock. That's how I know it.
Yeah, I think that, who was that original one? It's Edwin Starr. I think that was his name.
Yeah, from Rush Hour, I think that's what the movie was called, Rush Hour. Yeah. They sing it in that movie. It's funny. I think that I don't think it's realistic. I think it's right, but I don't think it's realistic. And also, I don't know how to use this in my life, I guess.
Anybody else have
Because
some?
it's about
Sorry, go ahead.
something I'm not involved in, really.
Well, there's a thread of thought that seems to be pretty prevalent and have been around for a long time and been more prevalent at certain times than others, that war is a necessary evil, or humankind will always have war. It's something that humans, like, in a sense, can't exist without. And at least I've noticed in the absence, this does not seem to be saying war is inevitable and will always be with us. It seems to imply that, well, like, if war is bad, then it actually is something we can do without and would be better off without.
Yeah, I think it definitely would favor there not being war. But it's also very clear that it's not saying that war never happens, or that there's never a need for it. But should that need arise, how do we approach it? Do we approach it as mourning the great loss of life, or do we celebrate in that victory?
I feel it's I like what you just said, Jinder. It's kind of open to the idea that it may happen and trying to deglorify that, but it's kind of avoiding the what to do, how to prevent it, or how to ensure that people do not do that. Just because we deglorify doesn't mean that we obviously remove the people who would thrive for it or strive to make it happen or gain some power there. So it's kind of avoiding that particular section, which I think is the most important one. And if you're just going to deglorify, that's great. It's an overall temperature of the society, I guess, the community, but it's kind of lacking the how to identify, how to pacify those voices, how to try to not, because people, as Dane said, people will be inclined to do that, and how do we kind of process with those? But what I'm also kind of struggling with is not struggling with. It's kind of curious about is when you when you talk about the fulfilling yourself at the very beginning, and I know you had an alternative translation of, you know, guiding people on all to heaven. Like what the fulfiller to fulfill yourself is kind of new to me here.
Yeah, I'm not sure
And
why
that's
they
what kind of
chose
caught my
that
attention the most.
translation either. I didn't see. I think that
Sorry, one sec.
sure. I'll be answering some of your question here.
There you go. I can hear
Okay.
you again now.
I think that in terms of where they went with that translation, maybe was more of a move to translate this at a level that would be dealing more with personal self-cultivation as opposed to thinking about the maybe more original context, that is, how do you counsel somebody who's in a position of rulership. And so the ruler, in order to fulfill what they're trying to accomplish, would be, how do you galvanize people underneath you to gather around the cause, right? And so by translating it, fulfill yourself or your purpose, I think is misleading in that sense of trying to make it sound like it's more about self-cultivation. But I think there's a way you can still kind of get there. So there's a couple of points that have been brought up that I think we should address. So Martin, you said it says don't glorify the war, but it doesn't get at how do we change the hearts and minds that are behind this in the first place. So this isn't the only statement in the Daodejing. So I think we have to look at the fuller breadth of how it approaches it, because I think, especially when we're looking at that concept of the carved wood, we're getting at the core of how the Taoists see the cause of strife and violence in their culture at that time, which is the attempt to get people to conform to a particular way of being that is maybe beneficial for those at the top and for organizing different things, but it is not helpful for the individuals because it's not a natural fit. And so again, you have this image of carving that wood, of carving people up to get them to fit into these boxes that they don't naturally fit into. And when you do that, you end up generating that resistance. And that resistance is what's springing out here in all different ways when people are being either oppressed or controlled or trying to be fit into a certain box. That's going to be something that they're going to ultimately resist in different ways. Or it could also be situations of how things are distributed. Ultimately, you might have people saying, you know, we need to reorganize how things are distributed. And you see that happen at various times in history. So I think their biggest critique or counsel in that is that we have to move essentially from this idea of conformity, how do we get everybody to be the same, to this idea of harmony. How do we embrace the differences and weave them together in such a way that it actually produces something beautiful? And that would maybe be at the core of how they're looking at this social structure a bit differently. And then there's also some other things that we haven't touched on yet too much that are coming later in the text, where they seem to favor smaller groupings of humans. So rather than this large kind of empire view, it's more of these small community views that are maybe like semi-autonomous, that they all just kind of exist around each other and they all have kind of their own existence, rather than some large superstructure that's trying to control and organize everything. And again, we may have some real differences on whether or not we think that's practical, but I think that has to do with what their approach to the problem of, one, violence, but a number of other issues that are coming up in their context. You're on mute, Martin, or something.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. That makes sense. I think you're right. I am looking at it very discreet kind of way because I don't remember everything that you've done so far. So that's thank you for kind of recapping that. And I think that That makes more sense.
Yeah, and to go back to Taylor's thought too, in terms of thinking it doesn't really have anything to do with me. I'm assuming you mean that you're not responsible for whether we go to war or not, or how we do war.
Yeah, I think even if I spread this message, like I don't see the impact really having an effect, I guess.
Well, this is an interesting question. So if we look at it from a self-cultivation, right? How, kind of taking Gandhi's line here, be the change you want to see in the world. If I'm going to act in such a way that I don't glory in other people's suffering and death, if I don't, become a cheerleader for, this type of, whether we decide it's necessary or not, right? Because I know there's a lot of disagreement about whether some of these different conflicts that are happening, especially in today's world, are something that was unavoidable or something that's motivated by other means. That by not glorifying that, even if we're not necessarily condemning it, but we're recognizing the suffering that people are having to go through, and frequently the people had nothing to do with it, then that can have a ripple effect, I think. I'm encouraged by complexity theory and thinking about it from a social perspective. And the basis of this is that when you look at complex systems, frequently there isn't any kind of like top-down organization of the whole thing. Everything is much more kind of locally derived, in that the different pieces are working in conjunction to what their neighbor is doing, not the whole thing. So one of the classic examples of this is when you see starlings, these birds that fly in these interesting formations, and it looks like there's this whole coordinated group that's undulating and moving and creating these interesting shapes. It's like, how are they doing that? Because is there like some conductor that says, okay, everybody go here, now go over there? And there isn't. It's just that they have some very basic patterns of how each of them reacts based on what their neighbor did. And that happens all throughout nature. It's how the cells in our body function. There isn't like some type of top-down conductor. There's just individual cells that know, here's what I do if this is who my neighbor is, right? And ultimately that complexity builds up out of these smaller units that just have the idea of, how do I react to my neighbor? So we can think about, from social perspectives, some very similar things. If we start to have a different way of thinking, how do I react to my neighbor? And that becomes something that is inviting or encouraging or attractive to our neighbors, and they start to act that way, it can start to form a larger complexity, maybe of thought or social movement, that actually does end up in certain kinds of change happening. And I think we see kind of combinations of both of these in our culture having an impact. We definitely see an evolution of thought in sometimes positive and sometimes negative ways. So I would say in the negative ways, and I mean this in like how the process is working, not necessarily whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. That's another type of discussion we could have. But something like cancel culture. So canceling is a negative thing. That's why I say negative. Kind of took off, where it wasn't a thing before, and then all of a sudden it was a thing. How did that happen? It wasn't that somebody at the top just started telling everybody this is how you have to do it. It's like an idea that took hold and it spread, and it became a very powerful thing. Whether or not it was a helpful thing or not is another story. But those kinds of changes can happen in social moods through how another way that this is sometimes talked about is memes. And I know we use this in a very kind of flippant way in social media, but the origin of it is actually kind of like the social equivalent to genes. So if we think about genes in cells and how they work and how there's kind of like this evolutionary process that ends up promoting certain types of genes versus others, socially, there's ideas that take hold and evolve in different ways. And the term for that is meme. So genes and memes. And of course, it got kind of co-opted by social media stuff. And now it's just means any kind of silly picture that all of a sudden becomes popular. But it's really about ideas that shape cultures and take hold and take root and evolve in different ways.
And if you don't mind, Jay, I'm really passionate about this particular piece. And Taylor, when my partner and I started getting into the activism and trying to stand up for things that we believe in, this was one of the biggest obstacles we had to overcome ourselves. How do I change the world? How do I change the way the society works? And we always felt this dread of, I'm just too small. I cannot apply this. I cannot make any difference in the world. And I always think back on the paradox of success, that you need to be extra hardworking, but it doesn't matter if you don't have the environment to be successful in. And as we are successful, as we have any amount of success, we have to grow that environment for others to be successful. And so it's our kind of responsibility of a circle of, when we succeed, we need to make sure that the others have the ability to succeed as well. And but oftentimes in activism, we talk about go ruin Christmas, go ruin Thanksgiving, by when that uncle comes in as has those sexist remarks or homophobic remarks, stand up and make it, and just stand up for it and stand against it, just so you change the environment around you, even if it's just a small bubble, that it's no longer acceptable to behave a certain way. Even if you don't change the uncle's mind, he may still remain the horrible person, but at least in the environment that he doesn't feel comfortable speaking about those things. And I think this exact same thing can be applied for everything else, every idea that you have, whether, as Jim said, whether it's good or a bad idea in itself, as long as you don't stay quiet when the opposing part comes up, or when you actually do stand up and you do speak out on behalf of the things that you want to do, creating environments around yourself, talking to your friends about those things, and changing, not necessarily even changing their minds, but giving them food for thought. That's how we as the individuals spread what Jim was just talking about. We start those things. We either create spaces where the ideas are safe to blossom, or we create spaces where the other ideas are not safe to blossom, and we reduce people's comfort to be openly toxic, perhaps. So don't give up, and talk to your friends, talk to your family. And as I was just in the Trans Visibility Day rally the other day, I'd ruin some Christmas, ruin some Thanksgivings, and stand up for what you believe, and stand up for the people that you believe.
I think
good advice. Thank you.
One other thing that's interesting is it's not always, like, definitely there's this idea of speak up, right? This idea of how do we bring awareness through pointing things out. But I think there's also an interesting thing that we could look at with this particular example. If the idea is that war and even victory in war should be treated as a funeral, think about politically. I'm just going to use the Israel-Palestine or Hamas, however you want to frame it, conflict that's currently happening. Super high tensions on both sides, a long history on both sides, no easy way to sort this thing out. And definitely people who are advocating for both sides of this things in various ways. But what if, like, politically, it's very problematic? And we can even see some of this cancel culture stuff come into play with what's happening with some people who do speak out about what they believe. But imagine if, instead of trying to voice an opinion about who's right, who's wrong, what if it was treated as a funeral and it was simply mourning those who died? And it wasn't mourning just one side or the other, but just mourning the death and destruction. That says something that isn't easy to politically react against, because nobody can be mad at you for being sad that people died, or recognizing the tragedy of that. But it might cause them to think a little bit about, am I getting too excited about this? Am I getting too rah about this? I don't know. But it's just an interesting thought that kind of came to mind, that what if the protests or demonstrations started to become more of this idea of a funeral rite for those that had passed or those who had suffered? It'd be interesting to see what kind of transformation that could bring about in terms of the consciousness of how people are thinking about this.
I
So
wonder
actually,
though if we treat it as a, oh, sorry, go ahead, Martin.
no, go ahead, Taylor.
I'm just thinking, like, if we treat it as a funeral, where does resolution come into play?
And so
Well,
this is actually very similar. Sorry, Jim, I'll come back on that. This is
Yeah.
what we have seen so far, and there is a lot of celebrities who are taking a non-partisan stance, and they're taking shit from both sides. That they're not taking a stand, that they're not taking a side, that they're not standing for one or the other. And yeah, I've been in a very similar position myself. I'm trying to stay off Twitter into those conversations, and whenever it comes up and someone is really like one-sided, I'm trying to bring in the other side as well, whichever side it is, because as you said, it's a super complicated conflict. It doesn't have a really easy solution one way or the other, and being on both sides is viewed as you're just not taking any stance. You're spineless, and you're not standing on one for one or the other. And the cancel culture is coming for those who don't take one or the other side, whichever it is. And I think it's because exactly what Taylor's saying, because we're not solving the problem. I think both sides here feel on the spectrum of what the Tao says. When you need to, you need to. I think both of them kind of feel the same way, that they have been both cornered into, I have to defend myself now, and they're doing whatever they're doing to do something about their situation. So trying to find some resolution, whether it's good or bad. Let's honestly, there's a lot of bad there, but the seeking for any resolution then ends up creating more problems, and not standing up, not seeking any solution, then creates another aspect of you're not seeking a solution, so go away.
Yeah. Well, I not that I am got the solution for this for sure, but just as
Yeah,
some,
this is a hard example. I think, like, in general though, like if we're treating a war like as a funeral, where does resolution? That's my question, not specifically about this
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah, and this is where I was going to roll with that is, in terms of the side, the idea of mourning the dead is saying that you're on the side of life. And really, I think when we're thinking about conflicts of various kinds, it's usually something around the idea that life in some way is being disrespected. So whether it's the Palestinians resorting to the type of tactics they did because they were suffering under this difficult situation from Israel, or Israel being put in a difficult situation when the UN just basically pushed everybody out of the way to make room for a state, and having their enemies all around them. I mean, we're talking about some very complicated social stuff and politically how things were done, and we can't take the US's involvement in terms of supporting Israel. Again, not trying to make statements about if any of these things are right or wrong, but simply the humanity of the situation is fraught with suffering and fear and security all around. And it's the failure to address the issues about life on all sides that are ultimately leading to how these conflicts are breaking out. And I think perhaps, the mourning isn't the total solution, but it maybe helps to reawaken the thinking about what's actually going on here. Is we're dealing with people suffering before and after the conflict, and the before part is what needs to get addressed to stop how things get to the point where they're blowing apart. It's very difficult once we're so far into something to figure out how to wind it back, but I think ultimately there is no way to wind it back. That the only way forward is going to be for people, just my thought, to let go of the idea that something that maybe they are justly owed, that they can let go of that for the sake of how do we get to the next place, because there's no way to replace that. There's no way to go back. There's no way to restore loved ones that have died or tortures that have happened or undo any of those. Again, I don't have the answers to that, and I'm thankful I'm not in charge. But again, if we take it to our personal lives and we think about this idea of forgiveness, if we think about this idea of how do we feel when we've been slighted or wronged, how do we respond to that? How do we not return, violence for violence, but absorb that and find other ways to understand what's happening in that situation? There may be situations that are unreasonable. Maybe we end up being confronted by somebody who's, strung out on meth or PCP, and they're just out of control and they're using violence, and we just have to do whatever we have to do to stop it, right? But then maybe there's additional steps. What's going on in our society that's causing people to have to resort to this kind of self-medication in terms of what they're doing with drugs? Why is it so much of a helpless situation for so many people? What kinds of things can we do to help bring that kind of thing around? But those some different ideas, no real solutions, but just some general positions that from that personal perspective might be applicable.
I would even maybe add to that, Taylor. One of the things that I also kind of struggle with in the personal life is the visibility and representation. And when I think about it in terms of I stand for something, and I don't know what to do, if I don't want to speak up necessarily, I can just show up. There's going to be rallies for one side or the other, and numbers and perception and representation kind of then matters. If you think about, if there's a rally that there's 50 people in there in a 1.5 million big city, it's probably not as important cause. But if suddenly more 100 people show up, 200 people, 500,000 people show up, and it becomes bigger and bigger, that particular cause becomes more, again, the space for this cause becomes more safe and more spread out. So again, if you want to stand up, or show up for the rallies around you, for the values that you have, for the thoughts that you support, and it can be, exhausting at times. I've been to not one too many, but to a few, and it even just I do nothing else than just be a body in the crowd, and I don't have to interact with anybody. I don't have to be loud about anything and stand up with banners and whatnot. But just even being there and giving the volume to the perception of that particular thought is a step enough to do something, and again show up for the thoughts or the ideas that you stand for, and hopefully at the end of the day you stand for things that are right, and you be the judge of what is right.
We've got a few minutes left. We haven't heard anything from Dwayne or Judy. Did either of you want to, or did you have any thoughts about this?
lots of thoughts, but I'm not going to contribute today. Thanks.
I have been thinking about religious wars and the fact that the principles that are supposedly being defended are more about peace and love. And yet there's this righteous feeling that I've got to go to war to get you to come to my side. And that causes me a lot of grief thinking about that. I lived in Japan right after the war for a couple of years, and I saw the devastation that was there, and I saw this conflict in what I thought was a culture that respected the elders. It spent a lot of time on dealing with peace and tranquility in their lives, and yet they have a huge side to their culture that is engaged in conflict and war. It causes a lot of questions in my mind about how cultures can survive with these contradictions.
Yeah. I think it's another example with both the culture and also the religious stuff about how there seems to be something in the human psyche that is driven towards trying to get to conformity rather than harmony. And I don't know, I suspect that part of the reason for that is everything has its identity in relationship to what's around it. And so if I have a particular vision of myself, but that vision of myself is very different from how everybody else sees me, then there's going to be that temptation of how do I get you to change your opinion of who I am so I can be who I think I am. And that can manifest either in actually demonstrating how I see myself on the inside in such a way that you begin to see it and recognize me as that as well. Or it can be a thing where I need to control that, like somehow feel like I need to control your perception of me in order for me to be who I need to be. And that's just at an individual level, but I think even at cultural levels, it can be the similar thing. And certainly with religion, at some level, this is another area you have to be very careful in talking about. There's an idea that we have some kind of truth in some way, which is why people are grouped together around a particular religion in the first place. And so the very concept of that can sometimes be problematic for how do we deal with people from other perspectives. And is there a way to be friends with them, or do they need to be like us in order for there to be peace? And those have obviously been big questions over the course of history that have not had happy outcomes. But yeah, I share your concerns.
Jim, I like that you mentioned complex dynamical systems, because I think that the study of dynamical systems and evolutionary theory actually has a lot to say about kind of the existence of conflict between groups of humans and sort of warlike cultures. Judy, when I heard you ask the question, how could a culture survive with these contradictions? How could it be peaceful on the one hand, but warlike at the same time? That actually made me think of the question, how could a culture survive without some warlike qualities? There was a Dilbert comic strip where Dogbert said something like he wanted world peace, because then he could conquer the whole planet with a butter knife. In other words, there's a dynamic in evolution by which, like, kind of the reason that psychopaths exist as maybe 1 or 2% of the population is because that's evolutionarily, that's a stable strategy at that level of concentration. If too many people are psychopaths, everybody is killing each other, and the species doesn't thrive. If there's no psychopaths, if everybody is completely generous and caring, but there's one mutation and one psychopath happens to arise, then they'll be able to totally dominate everybody else. And likewise, between groups of humans, if they're I think there's at least some pretty convincing evidence that the totally pacifistic and peaceful cultures that have existed on this planet were conquered by the warlike ones. So there's this idea that I've heard it put as, in order for humanity to kind of get through this bottleneck of existential technologies and existential risks, we have to learn how to, it's not about who wins the game of power, because whoever wins the game of power will just be the next tyrant, but it's about figuring out how to not lose the game of power while building an equitable, just civilization for everybody, but not being so pacifistic that you could be easily conquered or taken over. So in other words, the idea that you that one of the quotes earlier was war, that like wise people avoid war unless it's, whenever it's possible. Of course, it might be a matter of opinion whether it's possible or not. We could all go jump off a cliff and avoid war that way. But there's this idea also from martial arts that you always want to avoid violence at any cost. You never want to be the initiator. You want to avoid the circumstance. You want to avoid. But if violence does come into your life, you want to be the one who prevails. If you do have to go to war, you want to be the one to win, because otherwise, who's going to carry your humanistic values into the next generation?
Yeah, well, I always struggle with the fact that we have to bring this to a close. I very much appreciate the discussion we had today, and I know it wasn't an easy topic, but I think we had some fruitful sharing, and I really appreciate everybody being here today. To close it out then, if you've been watching this and you would like to be a part of the live discussion or join for our meeting that we have in person, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to both of those as well as links to the latest videos. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Jim.